Section 11 of Tanar of Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tanar of Pellucidar, Chapter 10, Pursuit. Awakening from a deep and refreshing slumber, Tanar opened his eyes and lay gazing up into the foliage of the trees above him. Happy thoughts filled his mind, a smile touched his lip, and then, following the trend of his thoughts, his eyes turned to feast upon the dear figure of his mate. She was not there, where he had last seen her, huddled snugly in her bed of grasses, but still he felt no concern, thinking merely that she had awakened before him and arisen. Idly his gaze made a circuit of the little camp, and then, with a startled exclamation, he leapt to his feet, for he realized that both Stellara and Jude had disappeared. Again he looked about him, this time extending the field of his inquiring gaze, but nowhere was there any sign of either the man or the woman that he sought. He called their names aloud, but there was no response. And then he fell to examining the ground about the camp. He saw where Stellara had been sleeping, and to his keen eyes were revealed the tracks of the Hymean as he had approached her couch. He saw other tracks leading away, the tracks of Jude alone, but in the crushed grasses where the man had gone he read the true story, for they told him that more than the weight of a single man had bent and bruised them thus. They told him that Jude had carried Stellara off, and Tanar knew that it had been done by force. Swiftly he followed the well-marked spoor through the long grass, oblivious of all else save the prosecution of his search for Stellara and the punishment of Jude. And so he was unaware of the sinister figure that crept along the trail behind him. Down across the tableland they went, the man and the great beast following silently in his tracks. Down to a cliff overhanging the sea the trail led, and here, as Tanar paused an instant to look out across the ocean, he saw hazily in the distance a canoe, and in the canoe were two figures, but who they were he could only guess, since they were too far away for him to recognize. As he stood there thus, stunned for a moment, a slight noise behind him claimed his attention, recalled him momentarily from the obsession of his sorrow and his rage, so that he turned a quick, scowling glance in the direction from which the interruption had come, and there, not 10 paces from him, loomed the snarling face of a great tarag. The fangs of the saber-tooth gleamed in the sunlight. The furry snout was wrinkled in a snarl of anger. The lashing tail came suddenly to rest, except for a slight convulsive twitching of its tip. The beast crouched, and Tanar knew that it was about to charge. Unarmed and single-handed as he was, the man seemed easy prey for the carnivore. Nor to right nor to left was there any avenue of escape. All these things passed swiftly through the mind of the Saurian, yet never did they totally obliterate the memory of the two figures in the canoe far out to sea behind him, nor of the cliff overhanging the waters of the cove beneath. And then the tarag charged. A hideous scream broke from the savage throat as the great beast hurled itself forward with lightning-like rapidity. 2 great bounds it took, and in mid-spring of the second, Tanar turned and dove head foremost over the edge of the cliff. For the only alternative that remained to him was death beneath the rending fangs and talons of the saber-tooth. For all he knew, jagged rocks might lie just beneath the surface of the water, but there was one chance that the water was deep, while no chance for life remained to him upon the cliff-top. The momentum of the great cat's spring, unchecked by the body of his expected prey, carried him over the edge of the cliff also, so that man and beast hurtled downward almost side by side to the water far below. Tanar cut the water cleanly with extended hands, and turning quickly upwards came to the surface scarcely a yard from where the great cat had alighted. The two faced one another, and at sight of the man the tarag burst again into hideous screams and struck out swiftly toward him. Tanar knew that he might outdistance the tarag in the water, but at the moment that they reached the beach he would be at the mercy of the great carnivore. The snarling face was close to his, The great talons were reaching for him as Tanar of Pellucidar dove beneath the beast. A few swift strokes brought him up directly behind the cat, and an instant later he had reached out and seized the furry hide. The tarag turned swiftly to strike at him, but already the man was upon his shoulders, and his weight was carrying the snarling face below the surface. Choking, struggling, the maddened animal sought to reach the soft flesh of the man with his raking talons. But in the liquid element that filled the sea, its usual methods of offense and defense were worthless. Quickly realizing that death stared it in the face unless it could immediately overcome this handicap, the tarag now strained its every muscle to reach the solid footing of the land, while Tanar on his part sought to prevent it. Now his fingers had crept from their hold upon the furry shoulders down to the white furred throat, and like claws of steel they sank into the straining muscles. No longer did the beast attempt to scream, and the man, for his part, fought in silence. It was a grim duel, a terrible duel. A savage encounter that might be enacted only in a world that was very young, and between primitive creatures who never give up the stern battle for life until the scythe of the Grim Reaper has cut them down. Deep into the gloomy cavern beneath the cliff, the tarag battled for the tiny strip of beach at the far end, and grimly the man fought to hold it back and force its head beneath the water. He felt the efforts of the beast weakening, and yet they were very close to the beach. At any instant the great claws might strike bottom, and Tanar knew that there was still left within that giant carcass enough vitality to rend him to shreds if ever the tarag got 4 feet on solid ground and his head above the water. With a last supreme effort, he tightened his fingers upon the throat of the tarag, and sliding from its back, sought to drag it from its course. And the animal, upon its part, made one last supreme effort for life. It reared up in the water, and wheeling about, struck at the man. The raking talons grazed his flesh, and then he was back upon the giant's shoulders, forcing the head once more beneath the surface of the sea. He felt a spasm pass through the great frame of the beast beneath him. The muscles relaxed, and the tarag floated up. A moment later, Tanar dragged himself to the pebbly beach, where he lay panting from exhaustion. Recovered, nor did it take him long to recover, so urgent were the demands of the pursuit upon which he was engaged, Tanar rose and looked about him. Before him were canoes, such as he had never seen before, drawn up upon the narrow beach. Paddles lay in each of the canoes, as though they but awaited the early return of their owners. Whence they had come and what they were doing here in this lonely cavern, Tanar could not guess. They were unlike the canoes of the Myocapians, which fact convinced him that they belonged to a people from some other island, or possibly from the mainland itself. But these were questions which did not concern him greatly at the time. Here were canoes. Here was the means of pursuing the two that he had seen far out at sea, and whom he was convinced were none other than Jude and Stellara. Seizing one of the small craft, he dragged it to the water's edge and launched it. Then, leaping into it, he paddled swiftly down the cove out towards the sea, and as he paddled he had an opportunity to examine the craft more closely. It was evidently fashioned from a single log of very light wood, and was all of one piece, except a bulkhead at each end of the cockpit, which was large enough to accommodate 3 men. Rapping with his paddle upon the surface of the deck and upon the bulkheads convinced him that the log had been entirely hollowed out beneath the deck, and as the bulkheads themselves gave every appearance of having been so neatly fitted as to be watertight, Tanar guessed that the canoe was unsinkable. His attention was next attracted by a well-tanned and well-worn hide lying in the bottom of the cockpit. A rawhide lacing ran around the entire periphery of the hide, and as he tried to determine the purpose to which the hole had been put, his eyes fell upon a series of cleats extending entirely around the edge of the cockpit, and he guessed that the hide was intended as a covering for it. Examining it more closely, he discovered an opening in it about the size of a man's body, and immediately its purpose became apparent to him. With the covering in place and laced tightly around the cockpit, and also laced around the man's body, the canoe could ship no water, and might prove a seaworthy craft even in severe storms. As the Saurian fully realized his limitations as a seafaring man, he lost no time in availing himself of this added protection against the elements. And when he had adjusted it and laced it tightly about the outside of the cockpit and secured the lacing which ran around the opening in the center of the hide about his own body, he experienced a feeling of security that he had never before felt when he had been forced to surrender himself to the unknown dangers of the sea. Now he paddled rapidly in the direction in which he had last seen the canoe with its 2 occupants, and when he had passed out of the cove into the open sea, he espied them again, but this time so far out that the craft and its passengers appeared only as a single dot upon the broad waters. But beyond them hazily loomed the bulk of the island that Jude had pointed out as Heim, and this tended to crystallize Tanar's assurance that the canoe ahead of him was being guided by Jude toward the island of his own people. The open seas of Pellucidar present obstacles to the navigation of a small canoe that would seem insurmountable to men of the outer crust, for their waters are ofttimes alive with saurian monsters of a long-past geologic epoch, and it was encounters with these that the saurian mountaineer apprehended with more acute concern than consideration of adverse wind or tempest aroused within him. He had noticed that one end of the long paddle he wielded was tipped with a piece of sharpened ivory from the end of a tandoor's tusk. But the thing seemed an utterly futile weapon with which to combat a terrorize or an azdarith, 2 of the mightiest and most fearsome inhabitants of the deep. But as far as he could see ahead, the long oily swells of a calm ocean were unruffled by marine life of any description. Well aware of his small experience and great deficiency as a paddler, Tanar held no expectation of being able to overhaul the canoe manned by the experienced Jude. The best that he could hope was that he might keep it in view until he could mark the spot upon Heim where it landed. And once upon solid ground again, even though it was an island peopled by enemies, the Saurian felt that he would be able to cope with any emergency that might arise. Gradually, the outlines of Heim took definite shape before him, while those of a meerkat became correspondingly vague behind. And between him and the island of Heim, the little dot upon the surface of the sea told him that his quarry had not as yet made land. The pursuit seemed interminable. Heim seemed to be receding almost as rapidly as he approached it. He became hungry and thirsty, but there was neither food nor water. There was naught but to bend his paddle ceaselessly through the monotonous grind of pursuit. But at length the details of the shoreline grew more distinct. He saw coves and inlets and wooded hills, and then he saw the canoe that he was following disappear far ahead of him beyond the entrance of a cove. Tanar marked the spot well in his mind, and redoubled his efforts to reach the shore. And then fate arose in her inexorable perversity and confounded all his hopes and plans. A sudden flurry on the surface of the water far to his right gave him his first warning. And then, like the hand of a giant, the wind caught his frail craft and turned it at right angles to the course he wished to pursue. The waves rolled, the wind shrieked, the storm was upon him in great fury, and there was naught to do but turn and flee before it. Down the coast of Heim he raced, parallel to the shore, further and further from the spot where Jude had landed with Stellara, but all the time Tanar was striving to drive his craft closer and closer to the wooded slopes of Heim. Ahead of him, and upon his right, he could see what appeared to be the end of the island. Should he be carried past this, he realized that all would be lost, for doubtless the storm would carry him on out of sight of land, and if it did, he knew that he could never reach Heim nor return to Ameilcap, since he had no means whatsoever of ascertaining direction once land slipped from view in the haze of the upcurving horizon. Straining every muscle, continuously risking being capsized, Tanar strove to drive inward toward the shore, and though he saw that he was gaining, he knew that it was too late, for already he was almost abreast of the island's extremity, and still he was 100 yards offshore. But even so, he did not despair, or if he did despair, he did not cease to struggle for salvation. He saw the island slip past him, but there was yet a chance, for in its lee he saw calm water, and if he could reach that, he would be saved. Straining every muscle, the Saurian bent to his crude paddle. Suddenly the breeze stopped, and he shot out into the smooth water in the lee of the island, but he did not cease his strenuous efforts until the bow of the canoe had touched the sand of Heim. Tanar leapt out and dragged the craft ashore. That he should ever need it again he doubted, yet he hid it beneath the foliage of nearby bushes, and alone and unarmed, set forth to face the dangers of an unknown country in what appeared even to Tanar as an almost hopeless quest for Stellara. To the Saurian it seemed wisest to follow the coastline back until he found the spot at which Jude had landed, and then trace his trail inland, and this was the plan that he proceeded to follow. Being in a strange land, and therefore in a land of enemies, and being unarmed, Tanar was forced to move with great caution. Yet constantly he sacrificed caution to speed. Natural obstacles impeded his progress. A great cliff running far out into the sea barred his way, and it was with extreme difficulty that he found a path up the face of the frowning escarpment, and then only after traveling inland for a considerable distance. Beyond the summit rolled a broad tableland dotted with trees. A herd of thags grazed quietly in the sunlight or dozed beneath the shadowy foliage of the trees. At sight of the man passing among them, these great horned cattle became restless. An old bull bellowed and pawed the ground, and Tanar measured the distance to the nearest tree. But on he went, avoiding the beast as best he could, and hoping against hope that he could pass them successfully without further arousing their short tempers. But the challenge of the old bull was being taken up by others of his sex, until a score of heavy-shouldered mountains of beef were converging slowly upon the lone man, stopping occasionally to paw or gore the ground, while they bellowed forth their displeasure. There was still a chance that he might pass them in safety. There was an opening among them just ahead of him, and Tanar accelerated his speed, but just at that instant one of the bulls took it into his head to charge, and then the whole 20 bore down upon the Saurian like a band of iron locomotives suddenly endowed with the venom of hornets. There was naught to do but seek the safety of the nearest tree, and towards this Tanar ran at full speed, while from all sides the angry bulls raced to head him off. With scarcely more than inches to spare, Tanar swung himself into the branches of the tree just as the leading bull passed beneath him. A moment later the bellowing herd congregated beneath his sanctuary, and while some contented themselves with pawing and bellowing, others placed their heavy heads against the bole of the tree and sought to push it down. But fortunately for Tanar it was a young oak, and it withstood their sturdiest efforts. But now, having treed him, the thags showed no disposition to leave him. For a while they milled around beneath him, and then several deliberately lay down beneath the tree as though to prevent his escape. To one accustomed to the daily recurrence of the darkness of night following the setting of the sun, escape from such a dilemma as that in which Tanar found himself would have seemed merely a matter of waiting for the coming of night. But where the sun does not set and there is no night, and time is immeasurable and unmeasured, and where one may not know whether a lifetime or a second has been encompassed by the duration of such an event, the enforced idleness and delay are maddening. But in spite of these conditions, or perhaps because of them, the Saurian possessed a certain philosophic outlook upon life that permitted him to accept his fate with marked stoicism, and to take advantage of the enforced delay by fashioning a bow, arrows, and a spear from the material afforded by the tree in which he was confined. The tree gave him everything that he needed except the cord for his bow, and this he cut from the rawhide belt that supported his loincloth. A long slender strip of rawhide which he inserted in his mouth and chewed thoroughly until it was entirely impregnated with saliva. Then he bent his bow and stretched the wet rawhide from tip to tip. While it dried, he pointed his arrows with his teeth. In drying, the rawhide shrunk, bending the bow still further and tightening the string until it hummed to the slightest touch. The weapons were finished, and yet the great bull still stood on guard, and while Tanar remained helpless in the tree, Jude was taking Stellara toward the interior of the island. But all things must end. Impatient of delay, Tanar sought some plan whereby he might rid himself of the short-tempered beasts beneath him. He hit upon the plan of yelling and throwing dead branches at them, and this did have the effect of bringing them all to their feet. A few wandered away to graze with the balance of the herd, but enough remained to keep Tanar securely imprisoned. A great bull stood directly beneath him. Tanar jumped up and down upon a small branch, making its leafy end whip through the air, and at the same time he hurled bits of wood at the great thags. And then suddenly, to the surprise and consternation of both man and beast, the branch broke and precipitated Tanar full upon the broad shoulders of the bull. Instantly his fingers clutched its long hair, as with a bellow of surprise and terror the beast leapt forward. Instinct took the frightened animal toward the balance of the herd, and when they saw him with a man sitting upon his back, they too became terrified, with the result that a general stampede ensued, the herd attempting to escape their fellow while the bull raced to be among them. Stragglers that had been grazing at a considerable distance from the balance of the herd were stringing out to the rear, and it was the presence of these that made it impossible for Tanar to slip to the ground and make his escape. Knowing that he would be trampled by those behind if he left the back of the bull, there was no alternative but to remain where he was as long as he could. The thag, now thoroughly frightened because of his inability to dislodge the man-think from his shoulders, was racing blindly forward, and presently Tanar found himself carried into the very midst of the lunging herd as it thundered across the tableland toward a distant forest. The Saurian knew that once they reached the forest, he would doubtless be scraped from the back of the thag almost immediately by some low-hanging limb, and if he were not killed or injured by the blow, he would be trampled to death by the thags behind. But as escape seemed hopeless, he could only await the final outcome of this strange adventure. When the leaders of the herd approached the forest, hope was rekindled in Tanar's breast, for he saw that the growth was so thick and the trees so close together that it was impossible for the beasts to enter the woods at a rapid gait. Immediately the leaders reached the edge of the forest, their pace was slowed down, and those behind them, pushing forward, were stopped by those in front. Some of them attempted to climb up or were forced up upon the backs of those ahead. But for the most part, the herd slowed down and contented itself with pushing steadily onward toward the woods, with the result that when the beast that Tanar was astride arrived at the edge of the dark shadows, his gait had been reduced to a walk, and as he passed beneath the first tree, Tanar swung lightly into its branches. He had lost his spear, but his bow and arrows that he had strapped to his back remained with him, and as the herd passed beneath them and he saw the last of them disappear in the dark aisles of the forest, he breathed a deep sigh of relief and turned once more toward the far end of the island. The thags had carried him inland a considerable distance, so now he cut back diagonally toward the coast to gain as much ground as possible. Tanar had not yet emerged from the forest when he heard the excited growling of some wild beast directly ahead of him. He thought that he recognized the voice of a Kodan, and fitting an arrow to his bow, he crept warily forward. What wind was blowing came from the beast toward him, and presently brought to his nostrils proof of the correctness of his guess, together with another familiar scent, that of man. Knowing that the beast could not catch his scent from upwind, Tanar had only to be careful to advance silently, but there are few animals on earth that can move more silently than primitive man when he elects to do so, and so Tanar came in sight of the beast without being discovered by it. It was, as he had thought, a huge wolf, a prehistoric but gigantic counterpart of our own timber wolf. No need had the Kodan to run in packs, for in size, strength, ferocity, and courage it was a match for any creature that it sought to bring down, with the possible exception of the mammoth, and this great beast alone it hunted in packs. The Kodan stood snarling beneath the great tree, occasionally leaping high against the bole as though he sought to reach something hidden by the foliage above. Tanar crept closer, and presently he saw the figure of a youth crouching among the lower branches above the Kodan. It was evident that the boy was terror-stricken, but the thing that puzzled Tanar was that he cast affrighted glances upward into the tree more often than he did downward toward the Kodan. And presently this fact convinced the Saurian that the youth was menaced by something above him. Tanar viewed the predicament of the boy, and then considered the pitiful inadequacy of his own makeshift bow and arrow, which might only infuriate the beast and turn it upon himself. He doubted that the arrows were heavy enough or strong enough to pierce through the savage heart, and thus only might he hope to bring down the Kodan. Once more he crept to a new position, without attracting the attention either of the Kodan or the youth, and from this new vantage point he could look further up into the tree in which the boy crouched, and then it was that he realized the hopelessness of the boy's position, for only a few feet above him and moving steadily closer appeared the head of a great snake, whose wide distended jaws revealed formidable fangs. Tanar's consideration of the boy's plight was influenced by a desire to save him from either of the two creatures that menaced him, and also by the hope that, if successful, he might win sufficient gratitude to enlist the services of the youth as a guide, and especially as a go-between in the event that he should come in contact with natives of the island. Tanar had now crept within 7 paces of the Kodan, from the sight of which he was concealed by a low shrub behind which he lay. Had the youth not been so occupied between the wolf and the snake, he might have seen the Saurian, but so far he had not seen him. Fitting an arrow to his crude bow and inserting 4 others between the fingers of his left hand, Tanar arose quietly and drove a shaft into the back of the Kodan between its shoulders. With a howl of pain and rage the beast wheeled about, only to receive another arrow full in the chest. Then his glaring eyes alighted upon the Saurian, and with a hideous growl he charged. With such rapidity do events of this nature transpire that they are over in much less time than it takes to record them. For a wounded wolf charging its antagonist can cover 7 paces in an incredibly short space of time. Yet even in that brief interval 3 more arrows sank deeply into the white breast of the Kodan, and the momentum of its last stride sent it rolling against the Saurian's feet, dead. The youth, freed from the menace of the Kodan, leapt to the ground, and would have fled without a word of thanks, had not Tanar covered him with another arrow and commanded him to halt. The snake, seeing another man and realizing perhaps that the odds were now against him, hesitated a moment and then withdrew into the foliage of the tree, as Tanar advanced toward the trembling youth. "Who are you?" demanded the Saurian. "My name is Belal," replied the youth. "I am the son of Skurv, the chief." "Where is your village?" asked Tanar. "It is not far," replied Belal. "Will you take me there?" asked Tanar. "Yes," replied Belal. "Will your father receive me well?" continued the Saurian. "You saved my life," said Belal. "For that he will treat you well, though for the most part we kill strangers who come to Garb." "Lead on," said the Saurian. End of section 11.